Graceland was never supposed to feel empty. The house was built to be full of music, laughter, movement, people coming and going at all hours. For years, its light stayed on long after midnight, as if sleep itself didn't apply there. But one night, Elvis Presley stood alone in the hallway and reached for the switch. And when the lights went out, something else went dark with them. Stay until the end, because this story reveals the night Elvis realized that even a house full of memories can feel heavier than silence. Graceland was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, not peaceful, not resting, waiting. Elvis walked slowly through the long hallway, his footsteps barely making a sound against the polished floor. The walls were lined with photographs, frozen moments of joy, success, togetherness, faces smiling back at him from years that felt both distant and uncomfortably close. He didn't stop to look at them. Tonight wasn't about memory. It was about presence. Lights glowed softly in room after room, illuminating spaces no one occupied. Chairs sat untouched. Doors stood open. Everything was ready for people who weren't coming. Elvis had always liked keeping the lights on. It made the house feel alive. It made the silence feel less final. But tonight, the light felt exposing. Every illuminated room reminded him of how much space there was and how little of it was being used. Graceland hadn't shrunk. His world had. He paused near the living room, resting one hand against the doorway. The room smelled faintly familiar. Wood, fabric, the lingering trace of nights that had stretched until morning. This space had once been loud, full, impossible to quiet. Now it echoed even when he stood still. Elvis felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not panic, not sadness exactly. Accumulation. Years of movement without stillness. Years of people passing through without staying. Years of noise that made solitude feel optional until it wasn't. He moved again, slower now, toward the end of the hallway where the main switch waited. He knew it was there. He'd passed it countless times without thinking. Tonight, it drew his attention. Elvis stopped a few feet away from it, staring. Turning off the lights felt symbolic in a way he hadn't expected, as if doing so would admit something he had avoided naming, that the house no longer needed to be awake just because he was. He thought about the nights when Graceland had been full, not just of people, but of purpose, when music spilled into every room, when sleep was postponed because something was always happening. Those nights hadn't ended suddenly. They had thinned. Quietly, Elvis reached out and rested his fingers on the switch, without flipping it yet. The light hummed faintly above him, steady and unbothered. He wondered how long he had been using light as a defense against silence, against reflection, against the realization that a place could hold everything he had built, and still not give him what he needed anymore. The house didn't answer. It just waited. Elvis exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the vastness around him. He wasn't angry at Graceland. He wasn't disappointed in it. He was tired of pretending it could fill something it no longer reached. With a small, deliberate movement, Elvis flipped the switch. The hallway went dark. Not all at once. Just enough to change the feeling of the space. Shadows softened. The glow retreated. The house seemed to settle, as if relieved. Elvis stood there in the darkness, letting his eyes adjust. For the first time that night, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt honest. And as he turned away from the switch and walked deeper into the quiet, Elvis realized this wasn't about ending something. It was about finally allowing the house and himself to rest. The darkness didn't erase Graceland. It revealed it. As Elvis moved forward, the house shifted from something staged to something real. Without the lights guiding his attention, his senses adjusted. The soft creak of the floor beneath his feet, the faint hum of the building settling, the way air moved differently through open rooms. He walked slowly, letting his hand trail along the wall, not for balance but for grounding. Each step felt deliberate, as if he were crossing into a part of the house he had avoided by keeping everything illuminated. In the dimness, memories arrived uninvited, not as images, as weight. The living room felt smaller now, its familiar outline softened by shadow. Elvis stopped near the center, listening to the silence pressing around him. This room had once been impossible to quiet. Music, voices, laughter overlapping until the walls themselves seemed alive. Now the quiet felt dense. He realized how much effort it had taken to keep this place awake all the time. How many nights he had allowed noise to continue simply because silence felt too revealing. The lights had been his way of postponing something he hadn't wanted to face. That Graceland had outgrown the version of him who needed constant movement to feel real. Elvis moved toward the piano, its dark shape barely visible against the wall. He sat down without turning on a light, letting his fingers rest on the closed lid. He didn't open it. Tonight wasn't about sound. It was about acknowledgement. He thought about the people who had filled these rooms over the years, not in faces or names, but in presence. How easy it had been to confuse company with connection. How many conversations had passed through this house without ever truly landing. The darkness made one thing clear. Graceland had never been empty. It had been crowded with echoes. Elvis stood again and walked toward the staircase. Each step upward felt heavier, not physically, but emotionally. The second floor held quieter memories, mornings instead of nights, routines instead of performances. Halfway up, he stopped and listened. The house responded with nothing. That nothing felt different now. It wasn't absence. It was space. At the top of the stairs, Elvis paused in the hallway, the rooms branching off in familiar directions. Without the lights, they felt less like places to be filled and more like places that had already said everything they were going to say. He opened one door and stood in the doorway, letting the darkness inside remain untouched. This room had once been important. It had once held meaning strong enough to justify its constant use. Now it felt complete, finished. That realization surprised him. He closed the door gently and continued down the hall. Each room told the same story, not of loss, but of conclusion. The house wasn't asking for more from him. It was asking him to stop asking so much from it. Elvis felt a quiet relief settle into his chest. He hadn't turned off the lights because he was sad. He had turned them off because the house no longer needed to perform. Neither did he. As he reached the end of the hallway and leaned briefly against the wall, Elvis understood something that felt both sobering and freeing. Keeping the lights on had been a way of keeping the past present. Turning them off was an act of permission. Permission for memory to become memory, not obligation. He stood there for a long moment, breathing evenly, feeling the house around him not as a symbol, but as a place that had done its job. Graceland had held his life. It didn't need to carry it anymore. And in that understanding, Elvis felt the first real quiet of the night. Not imposed, not forced, but chosen. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything in return. There was only one light left. Elvis noticed it immediately, a thin glow spilling from beneath a closed door at the end of the hallway. It cut through the darkness like a quiet insistence, the last reminder of a habit he hadn't fully released yet. He stopped a few steps away. This room was different, not because it held anything extraordinary, but because it was the one place he always left illuminated, the one space he told himself he might still need, a room meant for pauses, not endings. Elvis rested his hand against the doorframe, feeling the cool wood beneath his palm. The light inside hummed softly, patient, as if waiting for instruction. He didn't open the door right away. Instead, he stood there, letting the weight of hesitation settle. This wasn't about darkness. It was about choice, about whether he was ready to let even this last piece of the house rest without supervision. Inside the room, familiar shapes waited. A chair angled toward the window, a small table, a lamp that had been turned on and off so many times it felt automatic. This was the place he sat when the noise of the rest of the house felt too heavy, when he needed to feel a weight without being seen. Leaving the light on had been his compromise, a way to tell himself he wasn't finished, that something might still happen, that the night might still ask something of him. Elvis exhaled slowly and stepped inside. The light revealed nothing new, just a room that had already given him what it could. He crossed the space and stood beside the lamp, fingers hovering over the switch. The moment stretched longer than he expected, not because it was difficult, but because it was honest. Turning off this light would mean accepting that the night didn't need him anymore, that he didn't need to stay alert just in case. Elvis thought about how often he had lived like this, awake when there was nothing left to respond to, prepared for demands that never came, holding space for possibilities that had already passed. It wasn't strength. It was habit. He flipped the switch. The room slipped into darkness, joining the rest of the house without resistance. The quiet deepened, but it didn't press in. It settled. Elvis stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, then turned and walked back into the hallway. With the last light gone, Graceland felt whole in a way it hadn't before. Not empty, not abandoned. Complete. He moved downstairs again, slower now, the darkness no longer unfamiliar. The house seemed to breathe differently, as if relieved of an expectation it had carried for too long. When he reached the front door, Elvis paused. Outside waited the same night, the same world. Nothing had changed, and yet something had. He didn't turn any lights back on. He didn't look over his shoulder. He simply stood there in the quiet, understanding that this wasn't a moment anyone else would ever see or understand. That didn't matter, because some endings aren't meant to be witnessed. They're meant to be accepted. Elvis didn't sit down right away. He stood in the darkened living room, letting the quiet settle fully this time. Without the lights, the space felt larger, not because it had expanded, but because it no longer demanded his attention. The furniture disappeared into shadow, no longer asking to be used, remembered, or filled. For years, this room had carried expectations. Noise was supposed to happen here. Life was supposed to spill out of it. Now, it didn't ask for anything. That was the difference. Elvis lowered himself onto the couch and leaned back, staring into the darkness where the ceiling met the walls. His breathing slowed, sinking with the stillness around him. The house felt calm in a way he hadn't noticed before. Lighter. He felt it immediately, and it unsettled him, because the calm didn't extend inward. Inside there was still weight, not panic, not despair, responsibility. The kind that arrives when distractions are gone, and there's nothing left to lean on but yourself. Elvis realized that keeping Graceland awake had been easier than asking himself what he still wanted from it, from his life, from a version of himself that no longer matched the pace he was maintaining. The house had changed before he had. That was the truth he had been avoiding. In the darkness, he felt the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tragic. It was subtle, and subtle changes are the hardest to face because they don't announce themselves with urgency. Elvis thought about how often people assumed he needed constant stimulation, noise, company, movement to function. How rarely anyone considered that maybe all of that had been armor. The lights had been part of that armor. So had the house. Now that both were quiet, he could feel the difference between being protected and being supported. Graceland had protected him for years, shielded him, given him somewhere to retreat when the world pressed too hard. But support was different. Support didn't mean hiding. It meant standing still without falling apart. Elvis shifted on the couch, resting his elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. He didn't feel broken. He felt honest. The house hadn't become lighter because something had been removed. It had become lighter because something had been released. Expectation, performance, the need to keep proving that life inside these walls was still happening. It was happening, just not the way it used to, and that was okay. Elvis leaned back again and closed his eyes, letting the darkness hold without suffocating. He wasn't thinking about the future now. He wasn't replaying the past. He was simply present. That presence felt unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, but new. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to believe that turning off the lights wasn't a sign of decline. It was a sign of trust. Trust that he didn't need to keep everything illuminated to remain real. Trust that silence didn't erase meaning. Trust that rest wasn't surrender. The house remained still. And in that stillness, Elvis felt something shift, not dramatically, not permanently, but enough to matter. Graceland wasn't asking him to leave. It was asking him to stop holding it hostage to the past. As he sat there in the dark, Elvis understood that this night wasn't about the house at all. It was about learning how to stay without keeping everything awake. The longer Elvis sat there, the clearer it became that the house was no longer the subject of the night. It was a mirror with the lights off. There was nothing left to manage, no rooms to prepare, no atmosphere to maintain. Graceland had stopped asking for effort, and in doing so, it had exposed how much effort Elvis himself was still carrying. He shifted slightly, listening to the sound of his own movement in the dark. It struck him how rarely he allowed himself to exist without adjusting for someone else's expectations. Even alone, he was usually preparing for a call, a visitor, a demand that might arrive unannounced. Tonight, none of that came, and that absence forced a decision. Elvis began to recognize the parts of himself that had stayed awake long after they were needed. The constant readiness, the instinct to respond immediately, the belief that rest meant vulnerability. Those habits had once protected him. They had kept him sharp, alert, necessary. Now, they were simply heavy. He realized that turning off the lights wasn't just an act toward the house. It was permission for certain versions of himself to finally rest. The version that felt responsible for everyone's comfort. The version that believed silence meant abandonment. The version that equated stillness with loss of relevance. Those versions had done their work. They didn't need to carry the night anymore. Elvis leaned back and let the thought settle without arguing with it. Letting go didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical, like setting down something you didn't realize had been in your hands for too long. He thought about how often he kept moving simply to avoid this moment, the moment where nothing distracted him from his own interior landscape, the fears that were quieter than panic, but more persistent than noise, fear of becoming unnecessary, fear of being remembered more than understood, fear of rest. The darkness didn't respond. It didn't need to. Elvis understood then that he wasn't being asked to disappear. He was being asked to choose which parts of himself deserved energy going forward. Not everything, only what still mattered. He opened his eyes and looked around, even though there was nothing to see. The outlines of the room were barely there, softened into suggestion. The house wasn't watching him. It wasn't waiting for instruction. It had already let go. That realization carried a strange comfort. If the house that had held so much of his life could release expectation so easily, maybe he could too. Elvis breathed slowly, feeling his chest rise and fall without effort. He didn't feel finished. He didn't feel resolved. He felt honest. And honesty, he was learning, didn't arrive with answers. It arrived with permission. Permission to stop performing versions of yourself that no longer serve the life you're in. The night deepened around him, quiet and uninsistent. Elvis stayed, not because he was stuck, because he was choosing to remain where he was, without adjustment, without explanation. That choice mattered more than he had expected. Eventually, Elvis stood, not abruptly, not with intention, just when it felt right. He walked slowly through the darkened rooms one last time, not checking, not correcting, simply passing through. The house held its silence easily now, as if it had been waiting for this permission all along. At the foot of the staircase, he paused and listened. Nothing stirred. Graceland was asleep, and for the first time in a long while, Elvis didn't feel responsible for keeping awake. He reached the front door and rested his hand against it briefly, grounding himself in the familiar texture. Outside waited the same world, unchanged and indifferent. Inside, something had shifted quietly and completely. He didn't need to mark the moment. It was already marked. Elvis turned away from the door and headed upstairs, leaving the lower floor in darkness. The steps creaked softly beneath him, not in complaint but acknowledgement. When he reached his room, he didn't turn on the light. He didn't need to see to know where he was. He sat on the edge of the bed and let the stillness hold him without resistance. The night had taken something from him, not forcefully, not cruelly, gently. Expectation, urgency, the need to keep everything illuminated. Those things stayed behind. As Elvis lay down, the house remained quiet, settled, complete. There were no thoughts racing now. No need to replay or anticipate. Just rest. Graceland slept. And for the first time that night, perhaps the first time in a long while, Elvis allowed himself to do the same. Not as an escape, but as acceptance.